Good afternoon, everyone. First, I'd like to inform you that this webinar is being recorded. We have time after the presentation for questions. I am Bamidele Oshamika. I am the Regional Climate Collaborative Manager at Green Umbrella. Green Umbrella is a regional climate collaborative for Greater Cincinnati. We have been serving as a backbone for the environmental and sustainability work in the Greater Cincinnati region for the past 25 years. Over the years, we have connected hundreds of members, local government, nonprofit, businesses, educational institutions, as well as passionate individuals through a collective impact approach to tackling the most complex and pressing environmental challenges for our communities faces. This webinar series is titled Changing Climate and Our Mental Health in Greater Cincinnati. This 1-hour webinar topics is we explore the connection between climate change and mental health. Our panelists will make brief presentations followed by a Q&A session. Then we will wrap up with the next steps and make some announcements. Green Umbrella serves 10 county region across Southwest Ohio, Northern Kentucky, and Southeast Indiana. Myself, Nobi Kennedy, our Regional Climate Collaborative Coordinator, Savannah Sullivan, and our Senior Director of Programs and Climate Strategy are the 3 primary staff members supporting the climate health equity work. Alongside our climate health fellows, Mitch Singer, a 4th-year medical student at University of Cincinnati Medical School, and Leah Rose, another graduate medical science student at University of Cincinnati. Green Umbrella joins more than 30 other collaboratives across the country, all of them working on a cross-jurisdictional climate action. With the previous change in Green Umbrella's identity from Regional Sustainability Alliance to a Regional Climate Collaborative, Green Umbrella joins more than 30 other collaborators across the country, all of them working on a cross-jurisdictional climate action. And given our staff and existing programs, our partnership have been established over the past 25 years. We are now the largest regional collaborative in the country. One of the things we are most excited about is weaving our existing programming and resources into the regional climate collaborative model. The new framework now builds all the works we've accomplished with our members and our partners as a Sustainability Alliance, while providing more impactful climate action, tools, and resources locally. As the climate changes, our region becomes more vulnerable to high heat alert, air quality alerts, breeding of new pests, health crisis, storm and flooding, and landslides. Addressing climate change can feel overwhelming at this time, and it requires hard work. But if we do this right, we can address social inequalities, secure exciting economic opportunity, and create a more resilient, equitable, and thriving Greater Cincinnati. When we look at the type of work we do, we lead and participate in, we see it as a collaborative work that is helping to reduce emission, build resilient and equitable local food system, create and protect thriving green space, and support local communities to take actions on environmental and resilient priorities. It means we'll be on ground and equipping communities, equipping local leaders, co-designing regional solutions, and mobilizing resources to turn ideas into action and actions into impact. These efforts are all continuing, but with more explicit focus on program areas like the Common OSHA Project, Green Space Alliance, Green Schoolyard, Food Policy Council, 23 District, and much more. The Climate Health Equity webinar series built on a recently completed report done in partnership with Ciolo Analysis. To highlight the findings of this report and accelerate action on key related issues, we have released a public service announcement toolkit that is connected with these topics and that will also cover in this webinar series. Please visit our website and other social media platforms to download and read full report. The public service announcement campaign will cover 11 topics that is climate health based. And this topic is going to be one per month. It will provide data and shareable media materials every month. Additionally, the campaign will share actionable strategies at the individual and institutional and system levels. This small public service announcement campaign covers climate issues and mental health system outcome in Greater Cincinnati. Climate change creates chronic stress and increased worries and feelings of hopelessness. Acute climate events lead to increased rates of adverse mental health outcomes, such as anxiety, post-traumatic stress. Increased health waves cause more symptoms of mental illness, such as increased fatigue, aggression, and stress. Higher rates of suicide among farmers in Ohio have also been associated with an uncertain future from climate change. Then what can you do? What can institutions do? Individuals can participate in hope, can practice resilience, and become more active in and engage with the community, and spend more time in green space. Meanwhile, our institution can build a community support networks, create an alliance of climate therapists, create climate-based resilience training, and build cohesive communities. Please find more information on our social media platforms on what you and institutions can do to be more resilient towards the impact of climate change. At this juncture, we would like to introduce our guest speakers who will dissect the topic and be ready to answer to 5 questions. Our first panelist is Billy Fullwiler. Billy is an eco-social worker, Petchem organizer, yoga guide, and a board member of International Federal Social Worker. Billy is an Ohio regional organizer for the Climate Reality Project and a climate mental health consultant. Her interest concerns mental health, climate justice, human-animal bonds, nature connections, community building. She will share her thoughts from climate justice, mental health, nature building, professional, and healthcare provider perspectives. I will now hand over to Billy. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a beautiful introduction. It's incredibly joyful to be with you all today. I wanted to kick off my section of the presentation with just a short check-in question that we can answer in the chat. And that is, if you could take a moment and identify at least one emotion word that comes up for you when you're describing how you feel about climate change in this present moment. And I can answer out loud for myself. You know, I feel really hopeful and energized when we talk about climate change, especially when I get to be in community like today. And you can move to the next slide. So on the right-hand side, I have the climate emotion wheels from the Climate Mental Health Network, which is just a really great resource if you're trying to find the language or the words to support what's showing up for you when you think about how you feel about climate change and the work that you're doing in the world. But when we talk about climate change and mental health and that intersection, the number one thing that when I'm working with an individual client or an organization or a community is I'm looking at stress and the ways that chronic stress shows up and how it deteriorates our physical and mental health. And so I'm sure you are all very familiar with stress, and stress can be beautiful and adaptive. It can prompt us to action. It's responding to external stimulus. But chronic stress is really deteriorative. And there's lots of ways that that shows up with climate change, whether that's disrupting our routines and our ability to engage with our neighbors and our community. We know that climate change can isolate us, causing us to shelter in place. Or like in Ohio, when we had the wildfire smoke come down from Canada last summer, we're not able to engage in normal behaviors that benefit our well-being, like walking our dogs or playing in our front yards. We're not getting that positive connection and interaction. And those things might sound small, but when they happen day after day after day, they compound and impact our mental health, whether that's through fatigue and not being able to concentrate, difficulty connecting and communicating with others, increased irritability, the inability to sleep. And so all of these things can compound and impact whether we're feeling symptoms of anxiety or depression or other mental stressors. We also see that one of the common stressors, especially that our young folk are facing, is this inability to imagine or plan for the future. And so when we're talking about climate change, we have lots of communities that are inequitably experiencing huge stressors right now. And then we also have communities that are seeing and witnessing those stressors. So that difficulty to imagine a future with you in it that's safe really compounds with stress and how we feel about our mental health. Heat waves, though all extreme weather negatively impacts our mental health, heat waves are the best studied because they negatively affect the abilities of some psychotropic medications, which we don't do great education on. And we also see with that chronic stress piece, with increased irritability, heat waves really show increased aggression and violent crime. So we know for a lot of communities, summer brings a lot of stress, and that's cyclical. Every summer we worry about these heat waves and how they're going to impact our communities and how they're going to impact our safety. And then we have our good old negativity bias of constant inundation with negative climate news. And that's something I work on with my clients a lot is, yes, you should be informed and you need to have good information about what's happening in your community and around the world with climate change, but we don't get balanced news about all the good resilience and adaptation and solutions that are coming forward. And so working with folks to kind of shift that negativity bias so you're not being constantly inundated and stressed by bad news. And then for our frontline communities, there's really profound negative health impacts with pollution. So if you live near fracking or if you live near a fossil fuel or plastic industry in particular, noise pollution has a huge impact on our ability to sleep and our ability to concentrate, which can impact our mental health and feelings of anxiety or depression. And then we also see that folks that live in highly polluted areas have difficulty connecting or accessing the benefits of nature and time outside because it's not safe for them to be outside. And so stress is really the foundation. Chronic stress is really the foundation of what we're looking at when we're talking about mental health and climate change and what folks are experiencing on a daily level. And then you can go to the next slide. So I know I've committed the cardinal sin of PowerPoints of having a lot of words on my slides. Just know that you're welcome to screenshot these, or we can find a way to send you these slides. But something really beautiful is this growing language to describe these shared experiences of distress around climate injustice and climate change. And so when we talk about things like climate anxiety or eco-anxiety, which you might see a lot in the news, I want to name that these aren't diagnosable conditions. So the emotions that we feel in response to climate injustice are really valid reactions to really pressing challenges and injustices in the world. And so this language isn't meant to diagnose folks. It's meant to create a shared way to identify an experience and connect you to other people. But we do see sometimes when folks are isolated and they're not getting the support and resources they need when they're experiencing distress around climate injustice, that we do see folks that are moving towards isolation, hopelessness, and despair. And those have huge and profound impacts on our mental health, particularly leading towards feelings of anxiety, depression, and sometimes suicidal ideation, particularly for folks that are experiencing chronic lack of resources. You can think folks that are experiencing drought or displacement in particular. And so I won't go over all of this because we have such limited time together, but these are just things that I think are helpful to know to help us connect to these feelings of anxiety, is that they're really rooted in anger towards injustice. And so a lot of climate anxiety is born out of this response to unnecessary illness, death, and loss due to polluting parties and inaction by decision makers. And so they're rooted in this really core part of the human experience of we have a fairness bias. We want things to be fair and for people to have what they need. And these unnecessary losses have a huge impact on us. And these feelings, when connected to resources and community, are adaptive. A lot of times we want to avoid negative emotions, but when negative emotions prompt us to connect with others and take collective action, that's really adaptive. They connect us to our shared humanity. So while we might want to avoid or shut down when we're feeling eco-anxiety or eco-distress, really tapping into those feelings and connecting with others who are also experiencing that has profound benefits for our own health and then our community health. You can go to the next slide. I study ecological grief. I love grief work. Grief is not, as many people think, an act of despair. It's an act of love and community. And there are lots of benefits to communities that come together to mourn ecological losses, which can be physical, but they can also be cultural. The loss of knowledge and wisdom that is passed down and cultural practices. I work a lot in West Virginia in communities that have had their land polluted or degraded through mountaintop removal and extraction, have lost the ability to forage, and the stories that they told about mountains that were important to them. So it's not just physical losses we can grieve, it's anything we have an attachment to, which includes culture and anticipatory. So again, that future orientation is coming up of we might not have experienced a loss, but we know that it's coming. Like when I work with zookeepers, there's a lot of anticipatory grief around species that we're afraid to lose. So just like we can mourn when someone gets diagnosed with an illness, we can mourn for our planet knowing that illness is coming. Next slide. Solastalgia is one of the most beautiful words I've ever heard. It's that feeling of homesickness when you're still at home, or that lack of solace in your home. So when your land's been degraded or polluted and it no longer feels safe or at home, solastalgia is this really powerful language from an Australian researcher who looked at coral reef bleaching and wildfires and how we feel when our home has been damaged or changed. And again, not diagnosable, not an illness, but thinking about how do we talk about and connect around these shared experiences. And I just think it's really profound to have words to put towards our experiences. Next slide. And then my primary work is on trauma. I think following COVID-19, a lot of us are really deeply aware of the impacts of trauma. But what I want to mention with climate trauma is it's really deeply rooted in injustice. And so communities that aren't able to stabilize and get to a place of safety because they don't have equitable access to aid, that trauma isn't resolved, and it compounds with other mental health concerns and conditions that show up. And it's also cyclical. Like I was sharing before, a lot of communities are preparing for hurricane season and wildfire season. And so these symptoms come up at particular times, and we can be aware of how that experience is cyclical so we can support each other. Next slide. And then I won't go over these too much, but when I talk about risk factors, I just mean who's closest to climate injustice, who's closest to climate change, and how would that impact their mental well-being. And that's not to alarm us because it's normal to feel these feelings, but just thinking about, am I someone who's going to be more impacted by this? And how can I support my community and myself in thinking through my professional, my cultural connection to land, how close I am, how I feel about the world around me? And then do I have the resources I need? And that's something we'll share out afterwards, is resources that will keep us well and keep us connected when we're talking about these intersections. Next slide. And then what keeps us well and what keeps us safe? So the climate movement needs all of us. And so we need to be well and in community. And so when we're experiencing these normal mental health stressors based on climate injustice, what's going to keep us well? And that's when we get to be connected in a like-minded community. We have outlets for our distress, and we have these supports. And so one of the supports I really want to lift up and name in this presentation is celebrations. There are a lot of good things happening for our planet in ways that we're adapting to be more just and care for our neighborhoods and our communities. And when we gather in celebration, that has a huge protective factor on our well-being. When we're in relationship intergenerationally, when we're looking at our elders and our young people coming together, those movements are really strong, and we see lots of mental health benefits from those intergenerational mentorship relationships where both people honor the wisdom, and then making sure that you're in community. And so you are individually responsible for the climate change, and you can't individual action your way out of the challenges we face. So are you a member of a community that you can act with? Is totally supportive. So I'm glad you're all here today and in community. And then my last slide, if you want to go to the next one, is I'll send out a resource guide of just different supports where you can get information, be connected to community, or know when there is a disaster who you can call for help. And so I think I've gone over my time, so thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Bailey. Thank you for sharing your thought. So our second panelist is Dr. Zinga Dalila. Zinga is a licensed professional clinical counselor with a supervision designation and a licensed chemical dependency counselor license 3. She specializes in behavioral disorders. She is a clinical instructor at the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neuroscience, University of Cincinnati. Dr. Dalila is an author of a self-published monograph, Ascension or Annihilation, Surviving in the Final Thread to Black Lives. And she is the creator of virtual educational program, Black People for the Natural World. She is one of the scholars in our Climate Research Incubator 2023 to 2024 cohort. She will share her thoughts from clinical mental health perspective and also research academic institutions perspective. Dr. Zinga, it's all yours.
Well, I first of all want to acknowledge Bailey's presentation. She has a beautiful spirit, and I'm very grateful to be in this space with her. So if you can go to the first slide. First of all, I want to acknowledge that wherever we are in the United States, we're living on land originally inhabited by indigenous people who lived in harmony with nature. And 130,000 years ago, African people came here and lived in community with them. And 400 years ago, African people were kidnapped from our home and forced into chattel slavery to build this society. We cannot talk about climate change and the mental health of Black folks outside of the history of who we are, what has happened to us, and how that influences our mental health in the face of this existential crisis. Environmental racism is traumatizing. Our history of living, loving, raising families, and embracing our culture under the conditions of enslavement, Jim Crow, and school to prison pipeline policies and practices is traumatic. This is the backdrop to the stressors to why climate change is impacting our lives the way it is. Next slide. In 2004, studies compared Black and white environmental beliefs and concerns, environmental readings, recycling, and nature-based outdoor activities. While Black people engage slightly less than white people in these areas, there is not a significant difference. Some differences have to do with the perceptions, interpretations, and practices of the predominant white climate change activist community, with a predominantly white lens and implicit bias. Next slide. All humans engage in unconscious bias. We all swim in the same fishbowl. Either through formal or informal education, our minds create categories for processing new information. To efficiently and quickly analyze and evaluate numerous pieces of information, our minds create stereotypes, which results in our conscious and unconscious biases, leading to our decisions and behaviors. Thinking that we are the exception to this process can undermine and create mental health harm due to increasing the likelihood that we are operating unconsciously on our implicit biases. Next slide. Addressing mental health trauma is about supporting a safe environment for healing and then building upon people's strengths. Most Black people experience some degree of racial trauma, being the lowest of a melanin caste system, meaning you are born into it and there's nothing you can do to change it. That we love, build families, and excel in all levels of this society, despite all the environmental and economic obstacles, speaks to a beauty, genius, resilience, and generational understanding of sustainability that borders on supernatural. Next slide. Unless biases that start from unconscious biases that start from cognitive categorization in a melanin caste system do not differentiate between urban Black folks and rural Black folks. Each has different strengths and weaknesses. But importantly, this bias prevents urban Black people from seeing our historical connection with nature and our ability to see our strengths and capabilities that has helped us to work with the resources of the earth to survive and thrive. Biases do not recognize our history of African American environmentalists, such as Dr. Beverly Wright, founder of the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, John C. Robinson, biologist and birder, and former enslaved man, America's greatest agricultural researcher and educator, who spoke of the great consciousness of the universe, George Washington Carver. Biases prevent us from appreciating how historical African sacred sciences we retain today has helped us to be resilient. And finally, Black people's mental health and emotional health depends on how the caste system has impacted our identity. Next slide. Black people's mental health impacts our response to climate change and can include psychological factors such as the internal conflicts we experience as we struggle to escape our caste, resulting in anxiety, helplessness, and traumatic stress injury. Next slide. Black people's increased engagement in addressing climate change means encouraging our strengths, embracing a high stage of racial identity that reflects internalization and commitment to loving oneself completely and community building. Experience the freedom and power to act towards self-determination, and celebrate an identity that is bound to the earth and to the cosmos. Next slide. Towards that end, we can cultivate relationships with African American subculture groups, such as Rastafarians, Hebrew Israelites, people of Yoruba spirituality, Black nationalists, and the Nation of Islam, to name a few. These groups often navigate outside predominantly white spaces and embrace positive mental health and wellness practices that can serve as models for increasing climate change activism in the Black community. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zinga, for sharing your thought. So at this moment, I would like to ask these questions from our panelists. Please remember that you can drop your question in our chat. So we hope that we're going to have time to read them out and also answer them. So question one, I would like to ask Dr. Zinga, what are climate issues and how do they affect our mental health?
Besides some of the things that we have already touched on, I think there's some things that we also need to consider. Some of the effects of climate change, which we see today with migration from countries where people have been devastated by climate change and now are moving here to the United States, and they're being sent to Black and brown communities. Communities have to close schools for the people who have migrated here, causing anger, causing confusion. I think that's something that we also need to take into consideration of these secondary effects of climate change. Another thing I think that we also don't always talk about is gentrification. I think we think of that often in response to just, people wanting to move into other communities that are usually Black and brown. But there's been a lot of gentrification due to climate change, people wanting to move closer into the cities. And then that ends up with Black and brown people feeling captured, feeling hopeless, feeling subjugated and forced into other areas that are less habitable. So those are some of the things that I think we don't always consider, those secondary effects.
Thank you, Dr. Zinga. So I would like to also hear the same thought from Billy. So what are climate issues and how do they affect our mental health?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned displacement and migration, because especially where we are near the Great Lakes, we are going to be home to a lot of folks that are displaced, and we already are home to a lot of displaced folks, and how we navigate those relationships really matter. I think another challenge a lot of my clients face is invalidation of how they're feeling due to climate denial. We know that number of folks who don't see climate change as a pressing concern is going down as more folks have lived experience. But I think that disenfranchisement and that invalidation of what we're going through really is profound when you feel isolated. Another thing I see a lot in my communities is the loss of professions. In Ohio, we have a huge agricultural community, and our farmers are experiencing a lot of stress, and there's some great workers, social workers that I work with that are looking at suicide prevention and care for our farmers and other professions that are really closely related to the environment and the earth. And so I think there's a lot of loss of identity that folks are feeling distress about, whether they're not able to farm anymore, or other professions. We know our veterinarians are experiencing a lot of stress trying to keep up with the impacts of climate change. So there's a lot of relationships that are harmed. We have huge benefits from the human-animal bond. And when wildfire smoke or natural disasters happen and folks need to evacuate, we don't have the supports in place to protect our human-animal relationships. And so those are some of the things, whether it's professions or relationships, that I see that are really, really feeling a lot of distress. And then I work a lot with older adults, and that's where I mostly see ecological grief, and it's kind of intersected with feelings of guilt or shame around not doing enough. And that not enoughness shows up a lot in the climate spaces and organizations I work with, where there are folks who dedicate a ton of their time, energy, and skills towards the climate movement, and they're still experiencing losses or losing to polluting industries. And so that beating ourselves up and that not enoughness and shame and guilt show up a lot, even though individuals aren't responsible for these outcomes. And so that's something we work on a lot, is like that community of care and self-compassion practices, because we aren't responsible for losses we lose against incredibly wealthy, industries and organizations.
Thank you, Billy. I appreciate your responses. So, second question we'd like to hear from Zinga is, how do climate issues impact the mental health status of our community, especially the vulnerable populations like women, low-income community, LGBTQ plus population, Black, indigenous people of color, children, and among others? How do climate issues impact these populations?
Well, my focus is particularly on the Black community, but I think that some of the information that I talked about in terms of how people are traumatized when they're experiencing economic oppression, when they're already experiencing environmental injustice, because of living in communities that have been pushed to the outskirts, and factories coming in and creating pollution to our water, to our air, just lack of quality food. Those kind of things just continue to exacerbate with climate change, creating even more complex trauma. And I think that these things happen to all of these groups. I think one of the things that hasn't really been taken into a lot of consideration, although I see more and more of it recently, is people recognizing the trauma that children experience. And children and the elderly are most vulnerable into the heat, to the cold. Some of the things, we think a lot about heat, but also we don't think a lot, I don't think we talk enough about the drastic cold changes. I mean, there's a lot of people don't have the resources, the education to know how to keep themselves warm in a safe manner. There are a lot of deaths that occur with dramatic cold freezes, even in Texas. Those kind of things happen in people who are marginalized, who don't have the resources and the education. They suffer the most.
Thank you, Dr. Zinga. So we'd like to hear the same we'd like to ask a similar question from Daly. So how do climate issues impact the mental status of the community, especially the vulnerable population like women, low-income community, Black, indigenous people of color, LGBTQ population, children, and among others?
Yeah, those are great questions. Climate injustice takes every existing identity of oppression or experience of inequity and just amplifies it. And so there's lots of examples we can look at this with particular identities. I work a lot with some amazing disability justice activists, and we know that folks with disabilities are least likely to be able to return home after a disaster and being evacuated. We know that when I work a lot with especially trans, but all queer community members, a lot of the aid we have is based in stretchers and institutions that have harmed the LGBTQ plus community in the past and might discriminate against them in providing aid in current disasters. We know that renters in particular don't get the support they need after a disaster to be able to access funds to recover from disasters. And so any inequity that you see that already exists with oppressed communities is going to be amplified and really put into a higher context when we're talking about climate injustices, and particularly these continual disasters, whether they're a weather event or an industry event. And so those are some of the ones that I see the most in responding to community traumas. And then that inability to find clinicians who are a good fit. And Dr. Nzinga might be able to say more about this, but a lot of times we already know that there are inequities in finding a right fit therapist that folks are accessible, can afford, and feels safe to them. And so making sure that we can find mental health care that is the right fit for communities is a really huge challenge I see. I've shared some resources about climate aware therapists, and you certainly don't need a climate aware therapist, and any mental health clinician should be able to show up and support folks in the distress they're feeling. But sometimes, particularly if that's a primary concern for you, we want that climate aware therapist who really has thought about that relationship between mental health and climate injustice. And a lot of the climate aware therapists, are telehealth or far away from our communities on the front line. And so how do we bridge that gap and make sure that we're supporting community members and their local mental health initiatives?
Thank you, Bailey. Thank you for sharing your thought. So we have the third question here, which is this goes to Dr. Zinga. So what sustainable ways to address climate impact among these vulnerable populations?
The effects of climate change are coming stronger and faster, and the climate change models that try to predict the frequency and intensity of what's happening in our communities is they can't keep up. And so it's really, I think, important to understand that for marginalized communities, we also need to be thinking about how to help people to survive. We need to think about, just kind of basic, like teaching people survival skills. I mean, and I think we could prevent a lot of deaths if we would think not just about trying to halt what's happening or try to mitigate some of the harm, but try to say, this is happening, and how do we help people to prepare for disasters? So those are things to think about. People right now, I mean, we're talking about marginalized people, when we look at like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a lot of those things in terms of safety and security just aren't being met now. And when we're talking about the devastation that happens with climate change, again, as I'm saying, happening faster and more intensely, we need to try to help people to raise up on that hierarchy, that scale, if we can at least help to make sure that we're providing for some basic needs. And those things are some of the things that I think that we need to be honestly and clearly considering and preparing for, and helping communities to do that, to equip them with some of the tools they need, so then they can feel more confident. When people feel like they can get out of a cycle of survival, of just surviving, and they feel like they have some way of being prepared for what's coming, what's happening and what's coming, then they can be able to think more clearly and talk about it, what's happening, and be prepared and organized. But you can't do that if people are just trying to live.
Thank you, Zinga. So we'd like to pose the same question to Bailey. What are sustainable ways to address climate impact among these vulnerable populations?
Yeah, one thing we talk a lot about in my spaces is frontline communities are the experts. And so there's lots of folks in the climate movement that have a lot of great technical expertise and a lot of beautiful degrees, but folks living closest to climate disasters are the experts. And so making sure when you're thinking about who you're partnering with, who you're hiring, who you're funding, frontline and fence line communities are the experts, and that expertise should be recognized. But what Nsinga said is so beautiful of one, local is best. And so a lot of the resources we see are really national, or they focus on federal things. But what Green Umbrella is doing is so beautiful, because what helps people survive disasters is neighborhood connection and cohesion. And so the more connected we are to our neighbors, the better we do. And when I get clients who are experiencing climate distress, what I look for when I connect them with groups is, are they local? Do they meet in person where eligible? Like, are they forming relationships? Because those relationships are what help people survive. It's how you go door to door and tell people it's time to evacuate. It's making sure your neighbors have what they need, and to Nzinga's point, are ready for an emergency, and we can look out for each other. So neighborhood relationships and place-based work and honoring the expertise of frontline communities are the things that I see give people the most feeling of agency, empowerment, and keep people the safest.
Thank you, Bailey. So because of our time, so we have to jump a few questions we have here. So we go to the last question before we look at the chart. So this go to Zinga. So what can individuals or institutions do to address climate impact on mental health?
I think we have to be honest about addressing implicit bias and the lenses that we have, so that we can, as Bailey was saying, we can look at the people in the community as the leaders, as the experts. But we can't do that if we're looking at and trying to address this through bias, and that means that using cultural humility, engaging in cultural humility, there's some things we can do to address this. It might seem inconsequential, but it's about changing our minds, changing the way we think, changing the way we look at things. Having pictures around you in your environment that reflect people of African descent, Black and brown people historically, people who are warriors, people who are great leaders, families, showing loving families, showing children, showing people joyous, those kind of things. We need to, I say this over and over again, we need to change the narrative from looking at Black and brown people as though we're people that are down and out, and we need to just rescue them and see them as great and beautiful and powerful and resilient and full of ways of knowing, and that we need as humanity. So we need to change that lens, and something very simple is trying to be intentional about changing the images that you have around you, changing the way you think, so that you can begin to see all of the resources that are around us.
Thank you, Zinga. So, Billy, can we hear your thought about what can individual or institutions do to address climate impact on mental health?
Well, Nzinga said it really beautifully. So I'll just add from my experience of, I do a lot of work around burnout and people who care about climate justice and then get burnt out as a volunteer or a staff member. And something that I think we don't talk enough about when we talk about climate solutions is just that power of celebration and joy and creativity. And so we're seeing a lot of climate solutions in the arts. We're seeing the power of celebration. We're seeing the power of rest. And if there's anything I could say to climate organizations is allow your volunteers and your team members to rest and allow them to gather in celebration. The problems we face are pressing and we do need to respond to them, but we can't respond to them if we burn out or numb out or dissociate. And so giving your team time off, celebrating that time off and celebrating the wins that we do have, whether they're big or small, is going to keep people well and keep them connected to the work that we're doing.
Thank you, Billy. So now we'd like to take a couple of questions from the chat. Shirley, what are some of the questions you are seeing from the audience?
Thank you. So we got three really great questions. The first one is, and I'm going to summarize all this, sort of ask all three of them. I know we have a few minutes, so if both of you want to try to address what comes up in you with these three questions. The first one is, what are some good ways to deal with holding on to and letting go of anger about environmental and climate injustices? You know, the emotions that we have around these things, how do we deal with those emotions? And then the second is, what is something that we can do to help marginalized communities right now? And lastly, the current political climate, how can we deal with how that's complicating our conversations about these topics? So Bailey or Nzinga, which of you would like to start?
The question about dealing with anger, how do you deal with anger and how do you deal with injustice, is to transcend it, to rise, to access whatever higher power, if that's what you want to call it, that works for you. But that's nature. I mean, if you are concerned and love nature, then your higher power is all around you. And I think that goes back to what Bailey was saying about celebration. There's a lot of power in being able to tap into these intangible reservoirs of beauty and that we have all around us. Unfortunately, we haven't been using that, which is what's got us where we're at now. But it's, it is the most effective way. I think we have to for a lot of people, I think a lot of Indigenous people, that's what we do. That's who we are. We know that we're more than what you see. We know that we're generations of people are around us all the time. We have those things to pull on, to lean into, to celebrate. And I think that when we have that kind of power, we can't see that ourselves as being hopeless and downtrodden and wasting energy on being angry.
Thank you. Billy?
Yeah, you've probably heard the old therapy slogan, name it to tame it. And I mean, we should be angry about injustice, but the harder we resist our feelings, the less we're able to actually be with them and use them for climate action. Lama Rod Owens has this beautiful book called Love and Rage. I really recommend it. But yeah, anger towards injustice is normal and natural. And I think when we can actually allow ourselves to feel it and be in community with those that allow it to be present, it can be really transformative. To political power, that's another reason I really love local climate action, because local decision makers are our neighbors. They live in our communities. They see the challenges that we face more closely, and they're more accountable to us. And so there's a lot of power and movement in local climate action. And I know when the problem feels really pressing, we want big sweeping action, and there should be federal pressure where we see a lot of inaction. But sometimes to tap into our power and to get that sense of agency, I think focusing on local actions has a lot of both mental health benefits and positive outcomes. And it can give us that sense of agency to move towards those big federal and international pushes to be able to move towards climate action.
Thank you, Bailey. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Thank you, Zinga. So moving forward, let's endeavor to adopt those climate resilience strategies, including practicing hope, gratitude to nature, mindfulness, meditation activities, building a community climate grief support system, utilizing available tools and resources like ecotherapy, climate-based training, and finally, get access to balanced meals to get a climate solution. If you have anyone or you are struggling with suicidal thoughts, support is always available through 988. So we have few announcements to make. Our March climate health equity topic is energy efficiency, climate and health impact. Visit Green Umbrella online platforms to get engaged in our work and be part of the solution. Also, we hope you will join us in the May 2nd at our Midwest Regional Sustainability Summit, the biggest sustainability conference in the Midwest. Our theme for this year is From Vision to Action, and our keynote speaker is Jack Patterson, who is the founder and executive director of Chisholm Legacy Project. Register before March 1st for early bird rates. And to be inclusive, we also have a pay what you can option. Thank you for joining us today. See you next month on another exciting topic. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.